Hello again, this is the final chapter in our exploration of JavaConfig. And now for the hardest part of all. We're going to port the Spring Security and OAuth across to JavaConfig. I have to tell you that this chapter has been a real nightmare to record, which explains the delay in releasing it. I am sorry for that, but at least it's done now, and I hope you find this useful. Despite the amount of time I've taken to record this, it's taken around 2 weeks of solid writing and rehearsing. I think you'll find that the code that we're about to write is actually pretty simple, and I hope you're going to find it straightforward. In the rehearsing, I just had so many problems with the OAuth section, largely because there's very little useful documentation available at the time of recording. There is, of course, the sample application that you can visit on the Spring OAuth page, but as their application is slightly different to mine, and it will be slightly different to anybody's application, I guess, it was very difficult to work out what I needed to change. In other words, what was important in their application and what could I ignore? And I've come to the conclusion that configuring Spring OAuth is easy enough, but if you make even the tiniest error, it can be very difficult indeed to trace the root cause. So then naturally, we all do it, you start hacking around, and then you start adding unnecessary configurations, because you might see a working example on, say, Stack Overflow, and you accidentally pick up some code that you never needed. Then that code that you don't need starts to cause problems, and your situation then gets an order of magnitude worse, and you start digging a deep hole. So I've worked really hard on producing this video to come up with the simplest possible configuration that should work for you. You can use this as a basis for your own work, which of course you will want to extend and change, but do be careful to only include in your configuration the stuff that you really need. Now, I can't give you support on your own OAuth configurations, but I hope the code that we're developing here will be a really useful base for you. But that's all coming up a little bit later. That's the OAuth. Before we get there, we actually need to configure the standard Spring Security. And that's not too difficult at all, and in fact is really well documented in the Spring Security reference manual. So I'm assuming if you're watching this video that you have previously studied our Spring Security course, that's Module 1, and therefore you'll be familiar with this CRM system and the fact that we currently have an XML configuration called CRM Security Config. Now, this security config is quite big. It's about 100 lines of XML. But actually, most of this is there for the OAuth. If I can just go through here and pick out, there's really only 2 blocks of XML that are relevant to standard Spring Security. We have an authentication manager here, which we're currently using an in-memory user service for the authentication provider. On the Spring Security course, we covered how to use a JDBC-based authentication manager, and that's fairly easy. I'm not going to do that on this course. The details of configuring that, fairly straightforward. And then going a little further down, we have this HTTP block here from line 77, where we're saying consider all HTTP patterns, and if it matches, and really this is the key line 82, we're saying that to access any page on this site, you have to have the role of a CRM user. But we have made some exceptions. The CSS pages and the login pages, that's really important, are not going to be secured. This line here for OAuth is irrelevant for now. And we're configuring form-based login. Now, really, it's just these 2 blocks that we need to migrate across to JavaConfig. And my plan is, as on previous chapters, we'll create a new class in our config package. This is going to be purely for the security config, so let's call it security configuration. As previously, we're going to be annotating this with the @configuration annotation, and very similar to the previous chapter where we were building the web tier, we have a further annotation which is enable web security. Not MVC security, that's been deprecated, but enable web security. And this is going to give us a whole bunch of useful defaults. And it's really the same defaults that we used to get when we were using the security namespace from Spring. So again, I think I said something very similar to this before. Just think of that as a replacement to the security namespace that we were working with previously. But just as with the web tier, of course, we're going to want to configure our own settings. And instead of doing that through the annotation, we're going to use one of those configurers. The documentation for the standard Spring Security is actually pretty excellent. On the Java docs for the Enable Web Security annotation, it tells us that we add this annotation to a configuration class, just as we've done before, and this will give us the Spring Security configuration that is defined in a Web Security configurer. And what they're saying here is that more likely we're going to use one of the adapters that we saw on the previous chapter and overriding individual methods. And they have here pretty much a perfect example of how to get started. And I bet without even listening to me, you could take this example and run with it. But let's just have a quick look at this example, and then we'll have a go at attempting this for ourselves. We have our configuration class, which is going to extend the Web Security Configurer adapter. These are the three main methods that you have in the configurer. Rather confusingly, though, they're all called configure, so it can be quite difficult to tell what they're actually doing. But this first example here is showing you that if you override the method configure, which takes in an instance of web security, then you can use that to set a URL pattern for any resources that are going to be completely ignored by Spring Security. In the very early part of the Spring Security module, we used this technique to disable all security on the styles.css page. I've just recovered that file from an early copy of the workspace, so I'm just looking at this in Notepad. But that means that no security whatsoever is applied to that particular file. Well, that's the exact equivalent of doing what you've just seen here in the configure web security method. Now that is subtly different to the other approach, which was where in a HTTP block, we specify that for an intercept URL, for example, for the login.jsp file, we're going to allow access to all. Now, it is subtly different. This means that to this URL pattern, security is being applied, but we're going to allow access. Whereas to this file, we're going to apply no security whatsoever. It's a little bit of a technical point, and it doesn't usually make any difference which of the two approaches you choose. But if you were using this approach, then it would be in this method here that you set your ignoring rules. But then in this second method, again, it's called configure, but this one takes in an instance of HTTP security. What you're doing in here is defining all of the authorization rules. So this is directly equivalent to the HTTP block that we currently have in our XML, where we're setting up a series of intercept URLs. We'll be doing that in this method here. And notice that just as with the web tier configuration, they've got one of these fluent APIs. So this is actually all one line of code. I don't like this fluent API, I must admit, but I can see what they're trying to do. What they're trying to do is they're trying to make this match very closely the structure of the XML version. So bear that in mind when we come to implement this. And then finally, there's a third method here, and you can distinguish it because this is taking the Authentication Manager builder. So what we're doing in here is setting up the Authentication Manager, which we were doing in the XML here. So what we're going to need with our configurer is we're going to need this block and this block. So we need to do exactly the same then. So we need to make sure that this class extends the Web Security Configurer Adapter. Make sure you choose the right one. And then we selectively override the methods that we want. I think I'm going to do the Authentication Manager first. And just as on the OAuth module of this course, we're going to have a single user called RAC, password of secret, and they're going to be in the role of CRM user. Well, I'm pretty much copying from the Java docs here. It's a void method called configure, which takes in an instance of the Authentication Manager builder. I'll call the object auth. And that's going to give us access to the Fluent API. Really, your starting point in this Fluent API is whether you want this to be in memory or whether you want it to be database based. You'll find that there is an in-memory authentication method there, and there's a JDBC authentication method there. And of course, there are other authentication methods. If you're using LDAP, you would be starting from this method here. By the way, LDAP is coming up on a future module. It will be in module 3 of the Spring Security course. But we want an in-memory provider, and there are no parameters into that method because, as you've seen with the Fluent APIs, we're going to be calling a chain of methods. And these methods are specifically configuring the in-memory authentication. So if, for example, we wanted to plug in a password encoder like bcrypt, then we would do that right here. But there's not a lot that we need to do with an in-memory authentication manager. The with user method is the interesting one. This allows me to set up a user. The only parameter is the username. And you can probably guess now that if I hit a dot, I can configure the specific details for this user, such as is their account expired or locked, what authorities do they have, and what password do they have. So I think I'll go with password first. We're making it secret. We need to give them some roles, and there is a method there called roles. And this is a bit of an odd one. In our XML, the role was role_CRM user. But this roles method will automatically add the role_ to the front. So we actually just need CRM_user. And with these Fluent APIs, you do tend to need to be a bit artistic with the way that you lay your code out. It's kind of not quite standard Java, really. Now that's just configuring one user. You might expect that if we hit the dot, we can call with user again. Actually, we can't. And the reason is that these methods are kind of hierarchical. And if you just want to think of it as a bit like with the XML, when we've finished configuring this block of data, we use the .and method. And that basically takes us back to the top of the hierarchy. So after calling .and, we hit the dot again, we get the same methods that appear as a result of calling .in-memory authentication. So that means we can go right back to the top and we can add another user and we can continue as before. Now we only need one user here, but that's how you would have continued with that configuration. Well, you'll notice we have a compile error here, and it's because you'll find that all of these configure methods are declared as possibly throwing an exception. And it doesn't even say what the exception is likely to be. It's just a raw, bare exception. Now, I must confess that I just haven't had time really to drill into the reasons why they do that. It feels like really horrible, bad code, but I'm guessing there must be some restriction that means that that was really the best they could do. Now, the effect that that has on us is that we have to, for all of these configure methods, declare that it might throw exception. And frankly, you forget about it because we know it's not going to throw an exception at runtime as long as everything is configured correctly. So that's a bit ugly, and I don't really have a justification for you, but I hope you can live with it. So that's configured the authentication. The next job is to configure the authorization. So this will be another override and another method called configure. The difference is this takes the parameter of HTTP security. And it's very common, you'll see this in all of the examples and all the manuals, that we call this object HTTP. And I reckon the reason for that is, if we compare with the XML, I'm going down to here, your opening tag in the XML is HTTP. And when we start to use this Fluent API, it will feel very much like the XML. We'll need to import HTTP security. And a large collection of methods available in here. Really what we're going to see inside the HTTP object is just a reflection of all the things that you could previously do in the XML. So I expect to see some kind of a method in there that will allow me to set up the form login page. I will expect to see some kind of a method for logging out, a method to enable CSRF protection, and so on. And there'll also be a method to allow me to specify this pattern here. So I'm saying that this block should trap all URL patterns that haven't previously been configured elsewhere in this configuration. And then we have a series of intercept URLs. So just to check that, in the HTTP here, if I go for FO, yeah, I can see something for form login. I can see something for CSRF. But the starting point is we want to trap all of these URL patterns. Unfortunately, the method isn't called pattern. There's no methods beginning with the letters P and A. And it's because the type of pattern you can see here with the 2 asterisks is called an ANT pattern. I guess you probably know that already, but just in case, this style of pattern was originally developed by the creators of ANT, and it means recursive, so it will include any subfolders along the way. I'm sorry if you knew that already, but the reason for me saying that is that the method we're looking for is called ANT matcher. So for us, this ANT pattern is /***. Now the next method we need to call, and this is where things do diverge a little from the way that the XML was structured. Going back to the XML, what we want to do is we want to set up this collection of intercept URLs. And unfortunately, there's nothing in there called intercept URL. In fact, it turns out, and I'm really working from the Java docs that we just saw, but the method we're looking for is authorize requests. And I think the reason they've put that in is just to improve the structure of the configuration. If you think about it, this XML, it's a little bit ugly that we've got this arbitrarily long collection of intercept URLs that doesn't really have a block of its own. And I think the creators of the JavaConfig version think really it would have been better if it was designed like this. Authorize requests being a tag containing a list of all of our intercept URLs. And that looks a bit better structured. Of course, it doesn't work because that's not part of the XML. But it is part of the JavaConfig, and I just wanted to explain that. I'm only guessing at their reasoning there, but it seems like a plausible reason. So what we can do now is go ahead and include all of those intercept URLs. You definitely want to use good indentation here because these fluent lines of code can be very difficult to read. So I'm definitely going to be indenting at this stage to say that effectively everything that follows here is a child of the authorized requests block. The equivalent of the intercept URL is called ANT matchers, slightly different to the original ANT matcher. We don't need line 79 because that's for OAuth, and we will be dealing with that later. And I'll tell you why in a moment, but we don't need to include the login.jsp in this set of intercept URLs. But we definitely need CSS to be included, and we want to set its access to permit all. So the way that we do that is the ant matches will include the pattern for CSS, and we should find a method on there, which you might have guessed is permit all. Similarly to before, we don't need the /login to be permit all. Again, you'll just have to wait a few moments to find out why that's the case. But then we've really cut to the important line where everything else that hasn't been previously matched, you must be in the role of CRM user. Now you could use an ant matches for that with the /**, but there's also a method called any request. And that really means any request that hasn't previously been matched by an earlier intercept rule. So that's going to have an identical effect to using the catch all wildcard pattern. So there are two methods of interest here. The ones that we're interested in is has any role, which allows us to specify multiple roles that are permissible, but we only have one role, so we can go for the has role. Now, just as previously, we don't need the role underscore in front. We can just say CRM underscore user. So that is now replaced, and I think I'm going to start now deleting from the XML here. That's replaced this entire block of XML. Now we need to configure the details of the form login, and rather as before, if we hit the dot here, you won't find any methods for that because we need to go back up to the top of this structure. So you will find, as before, the method and. I'm trying to space this out as clearly as possible. I hope it's working for you. Not to maximize this. So we want to set up the form login, starting with the name of the login page. I hope there's going to be a method in there called login page, and there is. And the login page is login.jsp. We have an authentication failure URL. Annoyingly, is not called authentication failure URL. It's called failure URL. And we'll just rescue what I had before. And we have the login processing URL. Now, there is a default for that, but I decided on the Spring Security course I wanted to demonstrate changing it. So we'd better leave that in place. And again, it's a case of actually finding the corresponding method, which is going to be login processing URL. So that's /login. But now for the reason why we didn't have to include any of those URL patterns in this block here, because I can call at the end of all of this .permit all. And that's saying that all of the URLs involved in the form login we're going to permit access to. That is very different to the XML. I think it's quite a neat feature, that. And you don't need to worry about the ordering here. You don't need to worry that, okay, this any request is going to catch all URL patterns. So that's dealt with the form login tag. And the next tag is we're specifying a logout success URL, which is going to be going to allcustomers.html. So we'll do that again with an and to get us back to the top. And we should find there's a logout method under which we can specify the logout success URL. Well, I've just remembered that there was a bug in the code that we supplied with the OAuth module, and that is we changed the URL patterns to include the string /website/, and I just forgot to do that on the original CRM security config. It's a very minor problem, but you might just want to put that in now. We have a huge compile error again for the same reason. I won't go on about it. We need to throw an exception from that class. And for the standard Spring Security, we are actually finished. Now, I realize that I haven't shown you every single corner of the Java config for this. There are hundreds of methods available here. But the important thing is that you get the model of how this works. And therefore, you should be very confident that if in future, for example, you want to use a JDBC authentication manager, then it's a simple process of following the methods that are available in here. It works pretty much the same as the XML configuration. Well, before we try this out, we're going to have to do one final visit to the web.xml file, and we need to point Spring at this Java class. Now, we don't include this in the dispatcher servlet configuration. That's strictly for the web tier. As we had it before, the security configuration needs to be read in by the context loader listener. And it's actually a simple job of just adding our new Java class to the param value that we had before. That's the configuration of our business tier. I think they can be space separated as well, but comma separated is fine. And I'll do the same as previously. I'll copy the qualified name of that and paste it into there. So that should be enough to make it pick up the configuration. Let's rerun the build and see the difference. You definitely want to be checking the log before you rush to your browser. Well, it worked okay for me, so if you have any problems in your log, then just check your configuration very carefully. So to test this, we need to visit the usual URL, CRM website /allcustomers.html, and it didn't work because we went straight to the page. I'm kind of glad that happened. I'm going to leave it on the video because I would like to see a before and after, really just to prove that our configuration changes have had an effect. So I realized the thing that I've forgotten. We go back to web.xml. Of course, earlier in the course, we commented out this section here where we were configuring the filter chain. Without the filter chain, you're going to get no security at all. So we need to re-enable that and rerun the build. So again, a very careful check of the log here. Maybe we didn't have problems just because the filter chain wasn't running. That looks like it's deployed okay, so we'll refresh that link. And wonderful, we are being presented with the login page. Let's try a bad password, and we're being correctly represented with the login. And with a good login, that's working well. And let's check that we can log out again. And the logout's sending us back to the login page. And this was the bug in the code I mentioned before. If you log in again here, you want to go back to /website /allcustomers. So that's working well. I've just realized, just as I was doing that, there's one last thing that I forgot to mention. Here in the XML, we did have the CSRF tag, which if you've studied the Spring Security course, you'll know is for CSRF protection. Actually, that tag isn't needed because it's enabled by default, but just if you wanted to be really explicit about it, you could add in an and followed by .csrf. And in fact, there isn't an enable in there. So clearly the default is that it is enabled. But if you wanted to, and we will need to do this a little later in the course for OAuth, there is a disable method in there. So it's up to you whether you include that method. It really doesn't make any difference. It will be enabled by default. So we've got to a good point. We have our security, our standard security configured. And now for the big one. We need to look at OAuth. Now, if you're one of the people who have been waiting for this video to be released since we first announced it, you'll know that there was a really heavy delay in releasing this course. And that's because I had a really terrible time preparing this upcoming section on OAuth. And I know that many of you out there have had similar problems implementing OAuth using JavaConfig. One reason for that is that the documentation at the time of recording is very sparse, and the only useful resource that they provide is the sample project at the URL you can see here. And it is a good project, but when you look at the source code, it's very difficult to tell from their code which parts are important and which are not. And it's not very well documented code either. And I've taken so long to record this because I had so many niggly problems where I would get one feature working and accidentally break another feature. But actually, the end result of this work is that the code that you're about to see here on this video is pretty simple and straightforward. And I think the big mistake I made when I was preparing this section was I tried to do what I've been doing throughout this course, and that is going back to the original XML that I used on the previous Spring Security course. And I kind of went through here taking every OAuth tag and I tried to convert it across to JavaConfig. And I discovered that that was a really big mistake because the default settings provided by the JavaConfig for OAuth is totally different to the defaults provided by the XML namespace. So I ended up doing far too much work, and I ended up with a setup that was unnecessarily complex. As a quick example, if you've done the Spring Security module, you'll remember that we had to set up a user approval handler, and we had to wire that in order to remember that the users have granted or denied access to certain parts of the application. Well, it turns out you don't need to think about that when using JavaConfig. You will get it for free. Now, it's only when you want to go further than that and you want to tailor and customize the defaults that you have to get a little bit more complicated. So my advice to you, if you're building an OAuth system with Spring JavaConfig, is start with the simplest possible solution first. Don't try to include every bell and whistle. Just get the basics working. And we're going to be working together on this video right now to do just that. Now, I will be assuming that you're already very familiar with OAuth and how it works, in particular the 3 legs of the authorization code grant type. And I'll also assume that you're familiar with the system that we had set up on the Spring Security module. If not, check out that module. What we had there was a second website called MailMonkey, which it doesn't really do anything, to be honest, as an application, but it's simulating some kind of newsletter service that can send out mass email communications. And the deal is we want MailMonkey to be able to access in a secure way some of the resources that we're holding on this CRM system. So if you're not familiar with MailMonkey, please do check out the Spring Security Module 2, where you'll get all the details on it. But for this course, we need to get that system up and running. So you should have a folder called MailMonkey in your workspace. If not, you'll find that on the Practicals and Code folder in the starting workspace. And to open the project, we're doing a File, New Java project. The project name is MailMonkey, capital M's, and you should be able to click Finish. When you do that, if you see compile errors, it might be because your lib folder is empty. On early versions of the Practicals and Code folder for the JavaConfig module, we didn't include the jars for this because actually they're identical to the CRM system. But we realized after release that that wasn't a good idea. So the later versions will have the jar files in. So if you have no compile errors, then all is well. But if you do have compile errors, then what you'll need to do is copy and make sure you're copying all of the jars from the CRM system into the lib folder here. Then you should be able to refresh the lib folder and then select all of the jars and right-click Build Path, Add to Build Path. And you should now have a clean compile. As on the previous Spring Security module, I'd like to be able to just run one build.xml script. And earlier on in this course, we commented out the cross-linking of the 2 projects. So here on line 24, you need to re-add, if it's not there already, the name of this target here, which is called the Run MailMonkey build. Now, just before we run that build, I would like you to go into the MailMonkey project and find the build.xml file. And just as we did a little earlier in this course, if you go down to the point where the WAR file is being built, here on line 67, we actually want to exclude all of the JAVX jar files from the WAR. So cut out line 67, move it up to line 66, and we're going to change the exclude to be ** javax *.jar. And that's going to stop the poisonous javax.el.jar file getting in the way. Once you've done that, you can close that build script, and we actually just need to run the CRM system build now. And that should run both build scripts and create 2 WAR files. And you might just need to wait a little longer than usual because we've got 2 WARs deploying. Anyway, you should now be able to visit the URL localhost 8080 /mailmonkey /import from crm.html, and because that's a secure page, you should be redirected to the login page for MailMonkey. Now, we're not going to bother converting the MailMonkey project to use JavaConfig because it's all very routine, and I can leave that as an exercise for you if you really want to do that. For us, the important thing is that once we've logged into MailMonkey, we should then be redirected to the CRM system where we can log in, and we're then going to get a HTTP 404 because we have not configured OAuth. So that's the boring stuff out of the way. Let's start the work now of implementing OAuth using JavaConfig. So we use the Web Security Configurer adapter to configure standard Spring Security. For OAuth, there are 2 further configurers. One configurer is for the Authorization server. And as you know, that's the code that implements legs 1 and 2 of the OAuth process. And the end result is an access token being issued to the client. We will then write a second configurer, and that's for the resource server. And that's really the implementation of leg 3, where given an access token, the resource server then decides what resources can be served to the client based on the accesses that the user has granted. And similarly, we implemented that in the XML using the block you can see here alongside a few other helper blocks. So we have to work with 2 more of these configurer adapters. Now we hit a slight Java problem. It's perfectly acceptable to go ahead and create some new classes, one to implement the resource server and one for the authorization server. But you might prefer to have all of your security configuration in the same class. It's entirely up to you, but you will find it's very common to keep all of the security in one class. And in fact, that's exactly what the sample application does as well. So we'll start with the authorization server configuration. And I can tell you that all we need to do is extend the authorization server configurer adapter. But you can probably see the problem from a standard Java point of view. Of course, in Java, it's single inheritance only. We can't extend more than one class at the same time. And this is quite a serious limitation of the idea of these configurers. The workaround, well, I think the workaround is really quite ugly, but I need to show it you, and you'll need to decide if you like this approach or not. And if you don't like the approach, then it would be a case of just creating separate classes, one for each configurer adapter that you're using. The workaround is to, inside this class, create another class. So I could do something like public class, let's call this authorization server config. So we can call it anything we like, and we can make that class extend the authorization server configurer adapter. Now, I realize that that looks really strange to have a class inside a class. In fact, what we're going to do is we're going to make it a public static class. Now, this in standard Java is called a static nested class. And I freely admit I've managed to get through a 15-year Java career studiously avoiding ever using static nested classes. When I did my Java certification exam, there were loads of questions on the rules and the rather archaic and complicated mechanisms that you can work with static nested classes, but it's the kind of thing that once you've done the exam, you never think about it again. So it's quite an unusual thing to use. The only reason that we're doing this is so we can have multiple configure adapters in the same file. So it's a little bit of a hack. And what we need to do for this static class is it needs its own @configuration annotation. And we have a further annotation provided by Spring OAuth, which is called @enable authorization server. And it's that annotation that switches on lots of defaults. Now, just by using this annotation, this configures Spring OAuth to automatically set up all of the endpoint URLs that we need for authorization, such as /OAuth/authorize. Let's check out the Java docs for the authorization server configurer adapter. There are 3 methods in this configurer adapter. Very similar to the standard Spring Security configurer, the 3 methods are called the same thing. They're all called configure. They receive a different parameter, and these 3 methods are used to configure different aspects of the OAuth system. The first of the methods here, which takes in a parameter of type authorization server endpoints configurer, allows you to change the URLs that OAuth is using. For example, the /OAuth/authorization. If you needed a different URL, then you would configure that using this method. We won't need to do that, so we will not be overriding this method. There's a further configure method here which allows you to change the configuration of the token server. We won't need to do that on this module. That would be quite an advanced requirement. But what we definitely need is this third version, which allows us to configure the client details service. In other words, this is to declare the clients and their properties. This method here is going to allow us to do exactly what we did in the XML in this block here, where at the moment we're declaring that there's only one supported client, their ID is MailMonkey, they're allowed to use the authorization code grant type only, and so on. So we're going to be able to configure this using JavaConfig using this version of the configure method. So let's do that right now. So the method then is the public void configure. The parameter into here is type client details service configurer, and I tend to call this object clients. So we'll need an import for the client details service configurer, and as with all these adapters, we definitely want the override annotation there. You know the style of these Fluent APIs by now. We start by declaring whether we want this client details service to be held in memory or in a database. So the first method we can call is either in memory, or there's a version called JDBC. Now in a production system, you probably would be storing these in a database, but as I said, we're going for the simplest thing that could possibly work. We're going to start with an in-memory version. And then it's just a case of declaring each of the clients that you want to support. So the next method you'll find in the chain is the method called withClient. And that's going to take in the parameter, which is the client ID. For us, that is MailMonkey. And now if we compare with the XML, it's just a case of getting in all of these parameters. Which authorized grant types are there? So you'll find a method authorized grant types. Exactly the same as in the XML. The supported types are either authorization code, password, assertion and refresh token we've never used on these courses so far, but the Java docs here is a little misleading. There's also the client credentials, client_credentials is also supported. So we'll get that copied across to here. We need to determine what authorities this client has. I don't think we're actually using authorities on this project, but if you need them, then it's the authorities method. And similarly to the way that Spring Security works, we don't need the role underscore on the front. So they will have the authority of clients, and you could use that authority when you're configuring the access rules. We need to specify what scopes this client is allowed to access. And we determined in the Spring Security module that they would be the read and write scopes. Now be really careful here, and this is one of the problems I had when recording. Initially, I called the .scopes method and it read, write, but that will not work. And it will not work because it will think you have a single scope called read, write. Instead, you supply multiple strings in here. You can have arbitrarily many strings in here, one string for each of the scopes. Be careful there. And finally, we need the secret for this client. That's effectively the client's password. We're going for some secret key. So we call the secret method. Now, I'm not sure why, but in the XML that we have here, we only have one client declared. But by the end of the Spring Security course, we actually had a second client declared. And that client was a standalone client that we completely trusted. And we wanted them to use a different grant type. So I don't have the XML for that here, but I can easily add that client to the list by using the AND method, the same as Spring Security. That takes us to the top of this chain and allows us to create another client. So I can go on from that and call the withClient method. And this client on the previous course was called trusted, and they were authorized to use the grant type of type client underscore credentials. And again, for full details of this, you can check out the Spring Security Module 2. They had the authority called trusted, but most importantly of all, they were given their own scope called trusted, and they had a secret called trusted secret. So if you wanted to do a database version of this, you would call .jdbc there, passing in a data source you've configured, and then you could define all of this in a database table. And we have a compiler there because, as previously, we need to add the throws exception clause to the method. And that's all the work we need to do for legs 1 and 2 of the OAuth process. All that remains is to implement leg 3, which is the resource server itself. And I'm going to do that by using exactly the same trick here. I'm going to add in another configuration class, but this time the annotation is @enable resource server. And just as before, this is going to be a public static class. We can call it anything we want. This will be resource server config. And this time we're extending the OAuth class called resource server configurer adapter. Now this one's even easier than the previous configurer because there are only 2 configure methods in here. And really, the only interesting one is the first one here. According to the Java docs, we use this to configure the access rules for secure resources. And what that means is, going back to our XML, if I go to this block here, this was the settings for the REST service. And this declared that, for example, the customer's resource was only going to be accessible to clients who have the scope enabled of write, and so on. And so, in other words, the configurer method is going to replace the entirety of this block. So we'll keep this block in mind as we implement that method. So the method we're overriding is another public void, again called configure, but this time it takes in a parameter of type HTTP security. And we traditionally call this object HTTP because, as I say, it is going to replace the XML tag that we previously called HTTP. Now, the first thing that we need to configure here is that we only want to catch URL patterns with /REST in the front of them. And we use that to distinguish our REST web service from the user-facing website. So we can do that in here with HTTP dots, and it's pretty much the same as the standard security here. We have a method in there called AntMatcher, for which we can specify the pattern that we're wanting to catch. So that's /REST /. So all other URL patterns will be ignored by this configurer. Now I'll come back onto the create session in just a short while. The interesting aspects on here are the intercept URLs, and we define the intercept URLs exactly as we did in standard security. We have the method authorize requests, which we can then follow up, and I'll do a little bit of indenting here. We can follow that up with an AntMatchers method. And the AntMatchers will allow us to capture the pattern that you can see here. So we want to catch all URLs of /REST /customers. So we'll plug that into the method here. But we only want to catch here any post methods, because when we're posting new customers, we need to check that they have the scope of write. Well, that's very easy to do. It's just the first parameter into the AntMatchers method. And we can say HTTP method, and then we have the usual HTTP methods available here, one of which, of course, is going to be post. So we now need to specify, given this URL, if they're trying to post, who is allowed to access that particular URL? Well, we have the access rules defined in the XML version here on line 68. I have to warn you that the practicals and code folder that we supplied for this course in early versions of the course, the starting workspace had a slightly older version of the XML. I'm sorry about that. I think I took the code from the wrong chapter of the OAuth module. You should see here there is an OR statement for the trusted scope as well. If you're not seeing that, then you might want to re-download the practicals and code folder for the course and check out the CRM security config, and you'll see that it has been slightly updated. So we want to allow anybody who has write scope or trusted scope to have access to this URL. So I'll copy that expression, and we plug the expression in by simply calling access. And really, that's as complicated as it gets. We would just now go ahead and include further AntMatchers for the rest of the patterns. And it's very easy for this project because we're saying that any other REST URL, regardless of what it is going to be only accessible if the user has granted read scope, or if they have write scope, or if they have trusted scope. So in other words, really, absolutely any scope is fine for the other URLs. So we'll copy that into the access. On the course, we were experimenting with various options, and this just happens to be the final state that we ended up in. It's certainly good enough for now, though. Now, checking out the rest of the XML config, the filter business here and the expression handler, we can completely forget about for JavaConfig. All of that is handled properly. It's all pre-wired. We don't need to think about it at all. But there are a couple of things that we do need to think about. First of all, we have got the CSRF, the CSRF protection. Now, we want to disable that for these URL patterns simply because all of these are coming from the REST service, and essentially we're never allowing human access to these URL patterns. Therefore, we're not going to be prone to CSRF attacks. And I seem to recall that on the OAuth module, we had to disable these because otherwise we got CSRF exceptions. So we want to do the same thing here, and this is very easy indeed. Again, we use the .and method, which is ending the authorized request section, and then you will find the .csrf, and we can call .disable. Now, there is one further thing that we wanted. Because this is a REST service, we want it to be completely stateless. So we don't want the server to create a session for any request coming into these URL patterns. So we did that with create session equals stateless in the XML, and it's reasonably simple to do here as well. We can simply call the session management method, which doesn't take any parameters. Instead, it has a chained method called session creation policy. And that takes a constant. The constant is defined in the class called session creation policy. You have in there the equivalent values that we used to use with strings. The one we're looking for is stateless. I'm trying really hard to make this sound exciting, but it's a direct equivalent to the HTTP block you can see right here. Just as before, we do need to declare that this might throw an exception, and then everything is compiling. Now, as I said, in recording this course, I then went and tried to take all of the other beans that we created here in the CRM security XML file, and I tried to reflect them, but I can tell you that we now have reached the point where we have a complete OAuth configuration. And I think whether you like JavaConfig or not, I think I have to admit that they have done a pretty good job of getting all of the defaults right here in the JavaConfig. So I don't want to get confused by that XML file anymore, so I think I'm going to take the plunge and finally delete that XML file, which means we're finally XML free, or at least from the Java configuration point of view. Before we deploy this, there is a little bit of tidying up that I wouldn't mind doing. At the moment, we have this outer class, which is defining the basic Spring Security configuration. And of course, we've got these nested classes inside for the OAuth. Now, I think this will work. I think it will work perfectly well. But it kind of feels a little bit unsymmetrical that after these static classes, we then have a set of methods for the standard Spring Security. Well, actually, it's just two methods for standard Spring Security. It would work, but I'd like it to be symmetrical. I'd like to have the standard Spring Security in a static class of its own. So I'm going to do a minor little bit of refactoring here. I'll add in another configuration block, and I'm going to take the enable web security and I'm going to move it down onto this new class. So we'll call this class standard Spring Security config, just to be explicit. And it's this that's going to extend the web security configurer adapter. And I'll even remove that from the outermost class. And then we'll take everything that follows, the two configure methods here. They will need to be indented to the right, and we'll need a closing curly brackets there. As I say, you didn't need to do that, but it just feels a little bit neater to have separate static classes for each of the three major concerns. You do still need the @configuration annotation here at the top. Otherwise, the component scan won't find any of this configuration, and you'll be wondering why nothing is secured. That's the last of the security configuration that we need to do. I bet there's a few things I've forgotten to do with the project. The first thing to mention is that because I've put everything into the same class, security configuration, that means in the web.xml file, we don't need to do any further work because, of course, we're already picking up the security configuration via the context loader listener. But if you had created separate classes for this configuration, then you would need to add them here. So we can forget all about web.xml. There is one thing that I mustn't forget, and this is going back to quite a long way back in the course. Do you remember that we have a web controller called the OAuth Authorization controller? Well, it's this class that I'm using to present the do you want to grant access to read and write. And we created this back in the previous module, but earlier on in this course, I commented out the @controller line just to temporarily disable that class. Well, of course, we need to get that back in. So line 17 now, we want to remove the comment from there. Oh, before I go on, I have realized I have forgotten one very minor thing. And that is when we wrote this configure method for the HTTP security rules, I forgot to add on the @override annotation. And that's really crucial because without that, you can't be 100% confident that you don't have a typing mistake on this line here. Talking of typing mistakes though, just before I deployed this, I've just realized that in my hurry to get up and running, on line 48 here, I do have a typing mistake on this OAuth expression. And it is, can you see there that I've missed the round bracket off at the end of that expression? I think I probably just got confused there because, of course, we need a round bracket to close the access method. That wouldn't have been a problem because you would get an exception in the console as soon as you try to deploy that. So with no further ado, I think it's time we finally ran a build, and we are definitely going to be checking the console like a hawk. Well, it ran through okay for me, but I have to admit that's only because I have rehearsed this module for so many hours now that I'm not surprised that it's gone through okay. Check very carefully for exceptions. But I think that means we can now test this out. So exactly as we've done on previous modules, we'll be doing that by visiting the import from crm.html page, which will ask us to log into MailMonkey. And that's good, we're being forwarded to the CRM system. So that means that the authorization endpoint has been successfully secured. I guess I should try a bad password here, and good, that's being picked up. Now if I log in with a good password, well, this is excellent. We're now being redirected to the authorization page. And I think as an opening test, I'm going to allow read and write, and I'll hold my breath here. That looks really good. We are getting a full import of all of the customers from the CRM system. Exactly as on the previous course, we should now be allowed to export to the CRM system as well, because we granted write access. So let's try doing an export. And wonderful, there is the contact. Well, exactly as on the previous course, we don't have any way of revoking the access, at least until the access token expires, which I think is several hours. So the easiest and dirtiest way of doing that is just to redeploy, and because we're using an in-memory token store, this will wipe it away, and we can go back to the beginning of the process, and we'll try to import. But this time I'm going to deny write access. So that should mean that because we've approved read access, the import process has worked perfectly well. But now if I try to do an export, we are seeing a HTTP 500, which is saying there is insufficient scope for this resource. We need the scope of either write or trusted. And of course, the MailMonkey application could easily catch that HTTP 500 and present a nice page to the user saying, sorry, you haven't granted sufficient rights to do this particular task. Now, I had lots of problems with this, I think, because I tried to implement the approval handler myself, exactly as we did in the XML. But as you've seen, it actually works like clockwork without having to do any configuration in here. Only if you had special requirements would you have to implement a user approval handler. Although the recording process and in particular the rehearsals for this chapter has been really painful, it was really because I was trying to do too much work. The Spring OAuth JavaConfig has a very good set of defaults, and it's only when you want to go further than that that you have to start doing heavy work in here. The screen full of configuration you can see here is more than sufficient to get a good OAuth solution up and running. If there's any demand for it, in future I might record a module where we change the client details service into a JDBC version, and similarly the tokens that we're storing, we could be storing those in a database as well. But I promise you, once you've got this basic configuration up and running, it's not too difficult to switch across to databases. So I hope you found this course on JavaConfig useful. I did say at the outset that I'm not a fan of JavaConfig myself. Frankly, I find this Fluent API that's been designed to be just over-engineered and really no clearer to me than reading XML. I will admit that the XML for OAuth is horrible, but that's only because they didn't put good defaults into the XML version of the configuration. I get the feeling that the OAuth team have kind of abandoned the XML and they're not going to improve that any further because they only have the time and resources to work on the Java config, which is fine, but I don't think that's XML's fault particularly. So I realize this is a controversial area, and I am on future spring courses, I am going to try to make sure that we always give you the Java config and the XML so that whichever version you're working on projects, we will be able to support you. So that's it for this module. I hope to see you on future modules. We've got lots of modules coming up in the future, so as long as you keep subscribing, we will keep recording. So thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.